Okay, Ben, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready, John. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. Today's webinar topic is optimizing operations for net zero buildings, a topic that is on, I'm sure, a lot of our minds, and a topic that is important globally as we all face these challenges to get to net zero, to conserve resources and be good stewards of our natural resources. My name is John Heinz. I'm our VP of Strategic Accounts here at EnergyCAP. At EnergyCAP, we are a software company. We create solutions to help organizations get value out of their energy and sustainability data. Part of our solution is tracking carbon and working with organizations to measure the data that is important to them as they work on net zero strategies. And Ben, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Readman. I'm an industry analyst working in the smart buildings department of Verdantix. For those of you who aren't aware of who Verdantix are, we're an independent research and advisory firm. So we conduct market research into the smart building and built environment and real estate space. So this is an area of research we've been leaning into increasingly in recent years. So yeah, hopefully I can provide some interesting perspectives on where the market is at. Thanks.
Yeah, appreciate that. And just so everyone's aware, I'm calling in from the United States and Ben's calling in from London, England.
That's right.
And just tag teaming this again to emphasize the fact that we're all in this together as global stakeholders into doing what we can to work on net zero activities. The agenda for today, we're going to start with Ben, and he's going to give you a highlight of Verdantix and the research that they do and some of the statistics that they put out there that I think is very interesting and you all will find value out of. And then I'm going to talk about how you can leverage an energy and sustainability ERP to help in all the areas, well, most of the areas that Ben's going to talk about. And then again, if we don't get to Q&A, make sure to type in Q&A in the Q&A box. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Yeah, so just a quick disclaimer on this. So we are Verdantix. We're an independent researcher, so we don't endorse any particular vendor or service provider or product. So any sort of examples or our involvement in this webinar is purely just I guess, a representation of our own research. So just a quick disclaimer there and positioning where we're coming to this webinar from. Thanks, John. Next slide, please. So yeah, as John highlighted, what I'm going to talk about is kind of an overview of where we're at in terms of net zero buildings, the state of the market, how net zero features in the priorities of different key decision makers in organizations, and then provide a little view on where net zero is at in terms of a wider view and some of the key kind of focus areas and strategies that can help organizations to transition their buildings to net zero operations. So this first slide is kind of setting the scene, so providing an overview of the current landscape of net zero buildings and some of the key drivers. So the case for net zero buildings is kind of at an inflection point due to a series of risks and opportunities for building owners and occupiers associated with general transition of their buildings to net zero. So perhaps one of the most important changes in the last couple of years is energy prices. Typically energy management and decarbonisation has kind of lacked that really solid business case. So where energy prices are low, investments in key energy technologies have perhaps somewhat waned due to a lack of kind of financial benefits. But this all changed in the last year due to a massive shock in energy prices that I'm sure everyone on the webinar will be well aware of. And although the prices have somewhat cooled since then, what we have seen is that the vulnerabilities of the energy system have been laid bare. So even just about a month ago, on October the 9th, the European natural gas prices shot up 15% in a day on the escalation of the Israel and Palestine conflict as Israel closed down a natural gas field there. So as we transition to a more renewable-based grid mix, these kind of shock events are going to be more likely to be kind of present, and the business case for efficient and crucially kind of energy resilient buildings remains really strong. Additionally, corporate sustainability targets have also been picking up. So according to Net Zero Tracker, who are a organization that kind of compile data on net zero and sustainability commitments of corporate organizations, in the last 16 months, the number of public companies with net zero targets and pledges has risen 40% to just over 1,000. So that's public companies, large public companies for extra context. And these companies are going to want buildings that match those targets. So that's a big driver there. Emerging regulations is something I'll come on to in the next slide in a little bit more detail, as that's probably one of the biggest drivers. Reputationally, employees want to work for environmentally responsible companies, and they're increasingly perceptive of greenwashing and companies with kind of fluffy and unsubstantiated sustainability statements and goals. So there's a real risk to alienating workforce in a particularly competitive kind of environment where you're trying to attract the top talent. And then also, one of the big changes in recent years is the improving business case for energy transition technologies and general building electrification. According to the IEA, most, if not all, of the technologies that are required to transition the built environment to net zero by 2050 are already available on the market. Obviously, they're hindered by different kind of issues. So cost is probably one of the biggest ones. Availability of specialists to be able to install some of these technologies is also holding some of these companies back from investing in these technologies, but everything is there already. So it's a case of pulling the right levers, being able to leverage the technologies that are available. It's not a case of, oh, soon something will be on the market that will be able to enable us to reach our targets. Thanks, John. Next slide, please. So as I discussed in the last slide, this is a kind of a breakdown of some of the key regulations relating to building energy efficiency and decarbonisation. So what you can see is there's now kind of a patchwork of different regulations popping up in different regions and localities. It's now becoming fairly standard that there's some form of regulation either around reporting or making incremental improvements on either greenhouse gas emission or energy intensity within buildings. Some key examples. So a lot of them have a similar kind of formula. So Local Law 97 in New York and BERDO in Boston have stipulate certain timelines or I guess target times to reach certain emissions and energy intensity reductions. So that's really pushing the market forward, and the building owners are really starting to take note of that. One of the interesting notes is that if you are an organization with buildings in different localities and different international locations, then your regulatory exposure is going to be different. What organizations need to do is to be able to monitor the regulatory changes within their geographies and be on the ball to be able to not get caught out and risk any legislative or compliance-based risks for not adhering to some of the kind of unique regulations that are emerging in their localities. So really what we're looking at is net zero is no longer a differentiator to be able to gain kind of opportunities, but it's actually also becoming a downside risk for the companies that aren't able to start moving their buildings towards net zero. It's now a mandatory kind of expectation, and this will only increase in the future. Thanks, John. Next slide, please. So where does decarbonisation rank among overall corporate decarbonisation objectives and priorities? Everyone, I'm sure, is aware of the stats that states that buildings contribute to around 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with 28% of that being on operations and 11% of that being, or sort of 12% of that being on construction. So what we can see is building energy efficiency is actually like the second highest kind of decarbonisation priority area. This is taken from Verdantix's global corporate net zero survey. Who we spoke to there was about 350 key decision makers and directors who work in the sustainability and net zero and climate risk sort of area within corporate organisations. So everyone's aware that the buildings are a massive part of their carbon footprint. Obviously, this varies from organisation to organisation and industry to industry. But if you scan through any of the ESG and sustainability reports of some of the largest corporates, so Google, JP Morgan, Unilever, all have made explicit reference to how they're looking to tackle their building decarbonisation strategies and work towards net zero there. So everyone's sort of a lot of the large companies who have net zero targets are aware of the role that buildings will play within that. Next slide, please, John. Thank you. So fundamentally then, the facilities managers and heads of real estate and corporate organizations play a central role in the delivery of sustainability and net zero targets, and also on the reporting side as well. Real estate and facilities management have access to a deluge of data and control and authority over a lot of the emissions within corporate organizations, and it's really essential that they get involved in this process, and it's increasingly bleeding down from that C-suite investor level through to the sustainability department and then within real estate as well. It is a bit of a balancing act still. So this question here is from Smart Building Survey, where we spoke to just over 300 directors of facilities and heads of corporate real estate, and we asked them about what their priorities are, ranking priorities are over the next 3 years. And what you can see is there is a real sort of balancing act of competing objectives. So optimizing building operations, decarbonisation, and the whole healthy building, producing workspaces that support the health and well-being of their occupants, and then optimizing footprint, so killing all that excess space that companies have at the moment. So it's a real balancing act, and what we see is that decarbonisation isn't the overwhelming kind of consensus based priority at the moment. So that is perhaps part of the reason why decarbonisation probably hasn't taken off at quite the same rate yet. So they're still fighting, short-term objectives over the long-term, the perceived long-term objective of net zero and decarbonisation. Thanks, John. Next slide, please. So we then asked the same people, the facilities managers and the heads of real estate, what their sort of level of implementation for different energy management and decarbonisation projects across their portfolio was. So what we're looking at here is, in the blue bar is firms who have percentage of respondents who have implemented these technologies at all of their relevant sites, and then in the grey is multiple locations. The light green, turquoise is those who are evaluating or trialing, and then light green is not implemented. So what you can see here is that most firms are still in their early stages of decarbonisation. In fact, something even as simple as like implementing LED lights, still 30% of respondents haven't done that at all their locations yet. They're obviously prioritising kind of proven and recognizable kind of decarbonisation projects in terms of LEDs, BMS controls for HVAC or lighting, variable speed drives for HVAC. So they're really targeting the efficiency based solutions. Though there are still some, there is some growing interest in some of the more extensive, heavy duty CapEx intensive projects. So heat pumps within there. That's an area of developing kind of improving business case as costs come down and efficiency goes up, but it's still not yet widespread everywhere, and so the industry really has a long way to go. Yeah, thanks. Next slide, please, John. So with that in mind, where is the industry at as a whole? So that last slide was on occupiers, but this is some data from the IEA on all buildings. So buildings are not on track to reach net zero by 2050. So the chart shows global energy consumption within buildings by fuel type. So it shows where we are now, and then where we need to go to 2030 to reach net zero by 2050. So energy consumption is about 50% direct fossil fuels, and then 50% electricity as an energy mix. So a few things need to happen. Firstly, we need to decrease our energy consumption by 25% by 2030, which only really gives us about 6 years to reach that decrease, and that's within the context that even last year, building energy use actually is still increasing. So I think we're reaching a kind of a point of plateau. So that increase was only around 1%, but we still aren't even decreasing at this point yet. So the progress that's required is getting harder and harder each year until we start actually curtailing the amount of energy that we're using in building use. So the amount of fossil fuels needs to drop by 40%, and we also need to double the rate of retrofitting. So we're at just below or just around sort of 1% retrofit rate, but that needs to increase to just over 2% to 2030 if we are going to reach net zero by 2050. And the quality of those retrofits also needs to increase. So slightly difficult to get data on, but the depth of those retrofits needs to increase to be wholesale deep retrofits in terms of facade upgrades, building electrification, software and sensors, and general building control. So where we're at is overall still some progress to be made, but with increasing policy and regulation, hopefully the industry can start moving towards the right direction. Thanks, John. Next slide. Thank you. Well, what is a net zero building? So there's no one kind of, I guess, consensus on what a net zero building is, and that's one thing that can be holding the industry back to an extent. So here are just 4 examples of how you could potentially classify a net zero building. So overall, what we're starting to see as a greater consensus emerges in the market is a move towards whole life building carbon. So the World Green Building Council, they have their own sort of definitions on what a net zero building is, and they're starting to encourage a more whole life cycle approach. So that includes not just operations, but in embodied carbon in construction and commissioning stages as well. So I'll run you through a little bit about how you could possibly class different types of net zero buildings. So net zero operational carbon. So this building has no net emissions during operation. So that could be either due to energy efficiency measures or quite often kind of market-based tools. So that can be purchasing PPAs, offsetting, that kind of thing. So not leaning heavily on efficiency measures and on-site solar and generation, things like that, but using kind of external market tools to decarbonize. A net zero energy building. So this is one that is kind of highly efficient. 100% of the operational energy needs are met by kind of on-site renewables. Net zero embodied carbon. So that touches on that whole life cycle approach. So within the construction sector, using low carbon materials and sustainable building practices to ensure that it's the building is low carbon net zero emissions in embodied carbon and operations as well. And then the final version, I guess, or kind of category would be a carbon negative or energy positive. So these are exceptionally energy efficient buildings, ones that are so efficient and generate that much electricity that they're able to sell that back to the grid and become a prosumer of energy. There is an example of this. So Power Bratakia, sorry, in Norway is an example of a building that is that can be at times energy positive. So that's built on on the edge of a bay, and it's taken advantage of its positioning to build some nifty water source heat pumps that make the building incredibly efficient. And with its on-site generation capabilities at peak times can actually sell energy back to the Norwegian grid and produce another revenue stream for the building. But overall, the buildings that are net zero buildings are very few and far between. It's an issue across the industries, a lack of examples where these are kind of readily available as examples from which to build best practice for the industry. Thanks, John. Next slide. So a little bit more information about those kind of different types of buildings. So based on those definitions, you can end up with a bunch of different building types that all could be classed as net zero in some way. As mentioned before, the net zero operational carbon building. So this building would be kind of low to mid efficiency. Owner hasn't done a huge amount with it. Typically using on-site fossil fuels, backup diesel generators, that kind of thing. So this is lower cost than investing in kind of the infrastructure, but higher risk. So it's generally seen as greenwashing, as the building itself does not actually, it's not net zero energy build as the next one is. So the net zero energy building with very high efficiency, either a new build or undergone an extensive retrofit. The infrastructure has received some investment as well, and all systems will typically be electric, so no on-site fossil fuels. Majority of electricity will be supplied by either on-site generation or supplemented by the grid. So grid energy will typically be supplied through like a PPA. However, there'll still be some direct emissions through reliance on the grid. So that could be classed as potentially like a net zero ready building. So until the building, until the grid completely decarbonizes, this building would typically be still carry some emissions due to its reliance on grid electricity. I won't go into too much detail on the final two, as I provided a bit more information on those before, but yeah, that sort of gives you a view on the different types of net zero building on the market. So, thank you, John. Next slide. So what does a rough path to net zero operations look like? So some of you might have seen similar charts on different websites, perhaps on the World Green Building Council, but this provides a breakdown of the key stages required to hit net zero. So typically, this will start with emissions baselining and then move into energy efficiency measures. So really maximizing the amount of efficiency measures and reducing the amount of carbon is really important at this stage before investing heavily in some of the more capital intensive projects, as it will ultimately cost more to be able to install a larger heat pump, perhaps because you haven't optimized the amount of energy demand and efficiency of delivery of that demand. And then finally, the use of either on-site or off-site renewables will typically take that down. And then finally, purchasing carbon offsets at the final stage of that to reduce the final residual emissions or extremely hard to abate emissions. The general best practice is to start at each stage and work incrementally, rather than jumping between several of them, as it kind of doesn't create a necessarily coherent strategy, and it can actually increase costs overall. However, the bulk of this webinar will probably focus in around that kind of emissions baselining and efficiency level, which is the bulk of where the industry is at the moment. It's not yet the case that the bulk of the market have implemented equipment upgrades, as our data showed in the previous slide. but yeah, so it's an incremental steps, and it shouldn't be a reliance on carbon offsets for firms. It should be a reduce as much as possible through efficiency and retrofits rather than relying heavily on offsets. It is a strategy, but it with increasing focus on greenwashing runs several risks. So one thing that probably is understated on this is kind of the challenge of baselining your emissions. So often firms have incomplete or missing data, or data that lies in disparate or unconnected systems. So, you know, in some buildings, it can be that you can have emissions stored in Excel or on pen and paper in some cases. More modern buildings might have a software platform or a data lake where that's stored as well. So collecting complete data from across the portfolio is a big issue right now, particularly for different areas within the buildings, perhaps landlord controlled areas or tenant controlled areas where there's less visibility to see a whole building view. And many firms can kind of really struggle with this very initial baseline. Next slide, please, John. So what are some of the steps you can take to optimize operations for net zero buildings? So the first step is to measure and monitor. So it's the age-old adage: what gets measured gets managed. Sorry. Often firms can go down a few different routes with this. So smart metering or sub-metering is a good option for this. It's a route to get in. It can be to various success though. So one example. So Heinz in their property investment arm attempted to install a series of smart meters and software platforms to be able to get as much data coverage from across their portfolio as possible, but ran into several issues, having to use different providers in different geographies and having mixed success with the quality of sub-metering. It can be an issue in the industry in general that buildings are designed with sub-meters that are only able to collect data in-house, and they don't have too much thought about the in-use phase of the building. So that can be a potential pitfall. But ultimately, the idea should be to collect as many and aggregate as many different data sources as possible within either a software platform or with a centralized dashboard to be able to begin monitoring and begin your baselining to develop your strategies and ultimately develop your carbon pathway, perhaps through a tool like CREM, so the Carbon Real Estate Risk Excel tool. Next, reducing demand. So it's ultimately firms should be really focusing on occupant comfort. You should be thinking about how you can deliver optimal comfort with as little demand as possible. So this will involve ensuring that the building is operating through the right times, responding to occupancy, identifying any inter-system or intra-system inefficiencies, so making sure you're not heating and cooling the building simultaneously. And what that ultimately requires is an aggregation of all the building systems, and hopefully with control, hopefully a BMS is able to read all the different units within the building to be able to compare and contrast and ensure that everything is operating as it should be. Then delivering demand as efficiently as possible. So utilizing software and controls to adjust operations. So that could involve investment in occupancy-based lighting, LEDs, VRF systems, anywhere, variable speed drives, things based generally sequencing chillers and boilers as optimally as possible. Even in some cases, it could be, ventilating a building through natural using windows if it's applicable at that particular time of year. Basically, delivering the required level of comfort in the most efficient way possible, and then ultimately moving on from that. planning capital projects. So if you've carried out the previous steps correctly, then you should be able to identify some of the hotspots and energy inefficient equipment that are the priorities for being upgraded. And if you have good solid data, you should be able to move on to developing strategies and a good business case for where you can invest in new technologies. Next slide, please, John. And then the benefits to collecting all this kind of data is are kind of far beyond those early stages, though. So this slide breaks down some of the different use cases you can have based on the data that you collect at different granularities. So the same data can be used in different ways. So at the portfolio or campus level, typically that is where disclosures to regulators and corporate reporting happens, and that data can be at an annual frequency or even at a quarterly frequency. And then moving down into the building level. So this may require a little bit more investment to disaggregate some of the data that you have, particularly if you're on a master meter campus, or if you are leasing some buildings, or you have tenanted areas that you don't have, as a landlord or a building owner, you don't have access to that data. This can help with property benchmarking analysis, so identifying the poorest performing buildings within your assets. General building level reporting, and then with that kind of benchmarking, you can start to plan projects to be able to invest where you'll get the biggest bang for your buck. Utility bill verification and renewable energy procurement planning are probably some of the easiest business cases for initial smart metering at the building level. To be able to confirm that your billing, whatever your utilities build you, is appropriate and accurate. And then behind the meter, grid interactivity, which can produce a potential revenue stream. And we anticipate that as we move forward, we're going to end up in a position where time-based grid responsiveness is going to become a much more important strategy within general corporate and landlord energy management. So getting that data is vital to take part in those demand response programs. And then taking the data down to an even greater level of granularity, where the bulk of the facilities managers will be able to make significant improvements to the efficiency of their buildings, will be through predictive maintenance. So taking equipment data, being able to analyze that and identify inefficiencies, or get ahead of the game and be able to understand, or perhaps move from a condition-based maintenance program to one to a conditional-based one, from a scheduled one, sorry, I should say. Then demand-based or occupancy-based equipment control. This is going to be one of the biggest areas, particularly in the post-COVID hybrid flexible working era, where not all of the building needs to be heated all of the time. Being able to get smarter with when you heat and cool your building, predict levels of occupancy ahead of time to pre-cool or preheat a building, potentially do some night purging where you might cool a building overnight instead of firing up the chillers in the morning or something like that. And then energy monitoring and predictive analytics. So that will feed into all of the above kind of areas as well. Tenant and landlord engagement as well will be an important area to be able to build that kind of level of collaboration between tenant and landlord. Ideally, in a good situation, what you'd end up with is kind of centralized control across both tenant and landlord areas. It's not typically the case in the UK, but in Australia in particular, that's an area where there's been some good progress on that centralization, and they have some of the most energy efficient buildings and offices in the world. So and then general equipment harmonization and efficiency, so ensuring that building systems are not operating in conflict with one another. So fan coil units are operating at the same level. Being able to aggregate that data and identify inefficiencies is vital. But yeah, sorry, that was a real quick run through of some of the different use cases you can get for this data. So ultimately, if you are a facilities manager and you're starting to collect data at that level, it's entirely possible that you can use it, the data that you already have, for different use cases. It's just a case of manipulating that for different use at different levels, and that's where software can play an important role.
Well, that's great, Ben. I'm going to jump in at this time because I feel like that's really where companies like us come into play. Some of the areas that Ben highlighted are challenges I'm sure all of you are facing, and that we hear in the industry, and we've been doing this for over 40 years. And while the focus now is on decarbonization, a lot of the principles that Ben covered, occupancy, comfort, and retrofits in buildings, and being more efficient, and optimizing performance, and limiting demand, and doing some of those activities, that hasn't really changed over decades. It's just really where the focus lies. Instead of maybe cost or use or demand reduction, now it's the end goal is decarbonization and carbon reduction. This slide also, I think, captures and summarizes a lot of what Ben talked about. So you're talking about compliance and regulations that are out there that are really affecting all of us throughout the globe. Depending on where you live, you might live in an area that there's nothing on the docket right now in legislation. Oh, but it's coming, and it's really gonna, and then hopefully it does in ways, because the only way we get to really creating a better planet and limiting the harmful effects of carbon is if we all work together. And unfortunately, you need that legislation, and then as such compliance of the legislation to help really drive behavior and change in a really large way. The idea of the embodied building, I was kind of marveling at that when we were putting together these slides. The idea of a complete carbon build, neutral building, and then operationally to make it that way, like that concept seems so foreign, that you have all these materials that go into a building, and how do you make everything from start to finish completely carbon neutral. I think that's where we need to get. So it's a collective of the suppliers, manufacturers, builders, all the stakeholders coming together start to finish in the fabrication of materials to the building, and even deconstruction of buildings, coming together and working. And at the heart of all this, as Ben stressed, is data. Verdantix does a great job of putting together trend data, and we went over a lot of that today. What are building owners out there focused on? And you'll notice some of it is, like, number one is optimization, and it's not necessarily decarbonization, but it's starting to grow. And I'm sure if we follow some of these trend charts over time, we'll see some of those areas getting larger. But it's still a lot of the same projects that have been valuable for years. So none of that goes away. And in order to really see how these projects are paying off, you need the data. So this slide is kind of addressing a lot of this. You need portfolio level data to report to regulators for compliance, for shareholders, even just for directors and those funding projects. You need building level data to show performance and to report what you're doing and how you're saving. And then equipment and zone level, that gets more granular. It gets tougher to report on that in some cases because you need more hardware, but it's still valuable to have that data to track performance or areas to target, and but ensuring comfort in buildings and things like that. So really, there's a huge challenge out there for large data, making it usable, accessible, meaningful to everyone. And that's where our company comes in, and we're not the only ones out there. What we are doing is we are working on solutions to take your data and allow you to report the relevant information you need. We created this concept of an energy and sustainability ERP. So when you look at all the data from disparate systems, there's a lot that can be from BAS systems, and from your utility bill, and from meters you install, and from sensors, and EV charge and solar providers, and all these different means of data. You need to get it all to get together in one database, so then you can report on all of this to the various stakeholders. And so we are working on this concept of energy and sustainability ERP to be the single source of truth of all of your data. So that becomes the framework, so you don't have to go to 10 different systems to run one report to give it for compliance reporting purposes. And I'll tell you, it's challenging to do this. You have data from your utility providers that there's a mix of how that's generated, and you need to be able to sort through what's dirty, what's clean, what's renewable. You have facility information. Many of you have tens, hundreds, even thousands of buildings. Some of you localized, some of you across the globe. And as Ben said, across the globe, just because you have, like your headquarters are in one country doesn't mean that you don't have to comply with various ordinate, legislation and other types of reporting requirements for buildings that you have in other countries. So it gets really tricky to have the means to do all of that in disparate systems. We're seeing a growing trend in transportation metrics. So not just building decarbonization and the ability to optimize buildings, but you have fleet and you have transportation, and your employees have to travel to these locations. And so then that has a footprint to it. And that is cost of doing business and managing buildings. And in order to decarbonize, you got to have a handle on those types of activities. Operationally, we've talked a lot about that. Need to have comfort in your buildings, but be able to perform optimally as best you can and limit demand and some of those activities. And then lastly, supplier impacts. What are your suppliers providing to you? So if you want to have a embodied carbon building, well, that relies heavily on suppliers. And so there's a collective agreement here where you need to work with your suppliers to be carbon neutral, again, it's carbon neutral as possible. So then that in turn will impact you and you can report appropriately. So a lot of challenges out there. Ben said it best. You can't manage what you don't measure. And you need to measure your progress, and you need to be able to set a baseline. I mean, it's amazing to me out there that there's so many organizations that haven't even started on baselining. And I'm not trying to be critical, but it's, that is the place to start. You got to get started on that. And it doesn't matter where you do it, just start doing it. It's the activity of what foundationally are we doing today, because if you want to set targets and manage your strategies and be able to report towards your progress, towards your goals, you need that foundational baseline. But then again, you also need the ability to measure as you go. And I would say start simple. It doesn't need to be overly complex. Start simple and say foundationally, here's what we're using as baseline. Here's what our target is. Now let's start tracking towards progress. So there's tooling that we've developed to help in that effort, because that's the lens that you need to have. Where you are today, where do you want to get, and how do you trend to get there? Now, the journey on how you get there, that's the challenge. And you need tools to help. And the way we look at it is, you have data from all these different systems. You have vendor utility bills, you have BAS and EMS and SCADA and all these types of data systems that are collecting data on, assets in your building and zones. You need to have access to that data, strategically. You have asset and fleet data, on-site generation. We're seeing this more and more. You have just solar on top of your building, and you need the ability to understand what you're generating, what you're using, what you're selling back to the grid even, because you need to get the credits for that back for carbon reporting. And so just operating a building is becoming more challenging. We also have a lot of our customers we're working with that implement EV charge stations, and they need to work on separating that from their building and then allocating, various use costs and carbon appropriately from those types of activities. You have finance data like purchasing of items, and then just other type of sustainability data. Big challenge out there because you have large quantities of data. So it's at least our goal, our mission is to provide tooling to bring that data into one single central repository to give you the ability to make informative decisions and to take action on your data. And there's a lot of stakeholders in this. There shouldn't just be the sustainability group that's looking at the data and saying, hey, here's what we're doing. There needs to be stakeholders across different levels within an organization. And some of the major buckets that we like to identify is you have your energy team, your finance or accounting team, your operation, maintenance team, and then your sustainability team. And maybe sustainability owns the ultimate compliance reports and the, reporting to shareholders. But there's a lot of work and a lot of value bringing everyone together on the same data set and allowing everyone to get access to good tooling that allows them to do their job effectively. Now, where do you start? A lot of data out there. It's important to see what's available, and there's a bit of a effort to get, everything. So you got to start somewhere, and there's easier, low-hanging fruit data. And we've always looked at it like, start with your utility data, start with utility bills. If you manage buildings, you get bills. What's on the bills? Usage and cost information. Great. That's a place to start. Now, what that doesn't tell you is every minute of every day, every day of the week, what is happening in real time so you can really manage behavior and make changes and have good, insightful information. But there's a cost to get that. You need meters, you need sensors. So you kind of, as you look at this chart, there's the easier side and stuff, access to data that's readily available. And as you move towards tracking what you need to from a carbon standpoint, it kind of gets, at least in today's terms, limited availability and harder to get and harder to measure. For instance, a lot of you might be able to easily track the cost of purchases, but you don't know the actual carbon numbers from those purchases. And our internal VP of sustainability is really forecasting that, like in restaurants where you have your calorie numbers for food, you're going to start seeing carbon numbers for purchases. And if we had that, then we can kind of, the limited availability and harder to measure would be a little bit easier because now you have some of that data from your purchases. So we're starting to see some larger trends that we, you start to see that with air travel and things where they start to give you your carbon emissions and even allow you to buy credits. We'll start to see that more. And so you need mechanisms to track that. The other side that we think is really, really valuable is just interval data, is the granularity. It's hard to make change when you have a monthly snapshot or even an annual snapshot of some of this information. So having more granular data, as granular as you can get, allows you to monitor it better and take action quicker and understand, what's going on, in various places. But, there's a cost to get it. One of the themes we look at out there in the industry is we need improved technology. We need to do things better, smarter, faster, and more accessible. And those are challenges that we, the tech companies, need to take it upon ourselves, and we do. We're working every day to make data more available and accessible to you, but also more meaningful to you. Now, the other side of this that is really valuable as well is we don't want to make it more time consuming for you. So just because you have gobs of data, it doesn't mean you got to hire 5 people to now go analyze the data. So there's the ability to add machine learning to predict behavior and predict values. And then the alarming or the necessary reporting to show you when something is amiss. So call this the ability to add an FTE or a PT, full-time or part-time equivalent to your team just with technology. because it monitors for you and predicts where things should be based on weather and days of the week and hours of the day and things like that. And they can start alarming when things are not working appropriately. And not only that, you now have the tooling that says, okay, from a usage standpoint, we're off by this much. You can apply cost to it and say, well, this is costing us this number of euros or dollars or whatever your currency is. But next, it's tracking of the real-time carbon. So the machine learning can help in real time, track trends of what you are now consuming from a CO2 value in real time because, scheduling's off or something's amiss. We're seeing bigger growth in this area where the monthly or annual CO2, customers want more. And we're even starting to see some trends where they want to track their CO2 in real time as some of the factors are coming off the grid for how your suppliers are generating energy. So, a lot of times it's annual factors. Now it's looking at more real-time factors and movement from a real-time carbon tracking standpoint. Really helpful when, again, you reporting carbon, if today you're doing it on an annual basis, fantastic. But as you start to decarbonize and make strategies, tracking it more granularly is very, very helpful. Now, you might not be down to the 5-minute need, but the industry's starting to head in that direction. The other important capability is simulating savings potential. So Ben talked a lot about creating strategies in areas that the industry is using for project and retrofits and the ability to decarbonize, but some of those might not be good for you. Some of them might not help you get to your goals of carbon reduction. You might say, hey, that's a great idea, but one project could be way more valuable than the other. So if you have the granular data, at least of zones in the building or equipment, you can start to run optimization simulations to track what your savings would be from a use cost, but more importantly, from a carbon standpoint. So this becomes also very important as you're strategizing and prioritizing projects. Where's your biggest bang for the buck? Now, after you actually decide on projects, it becomes incredibly valuable, like vital, to track the payback. Can we verify the savings, hopefully using compliant, industry protocols out there to track the savings. And when I talk savings, I am talking cost, use, and now carbon. And some of the tooling that at least we're supporting now is tracking the avoided carbon or the carbon savings due to the projects you're implementing. And this is a newer focus for us, especially. We've been running savings calculations for decades, since the 80s. And we never had the lens of carbon savings, but that becomes really important. You got funding for this project. Here was your simulated savings. Here's your actual. It all becomes incredibly valuable. And then, in a lot of ways, what your payback period is as well. Some of the other valuable operations is to report on the sources of your data. If you're doing any type of purchasing of renewals or generation activities, it's helpful to look at those activities in real time so you can get a good handle on, what are you producing compared to what you're consuming, and even what are you, if you limit your consumption, if you're selling back, how much of the generation is going and being sold back to the grid, and then what type of credits do you get for that? Because the credits not only can come in cost values, it's also in CO2 values. So tracking those activities becomes another important lens that you need to focus on. One of the strategies that Ben had talked about was offsets and RECs. So if you have a building, you might not be in the embodied carbon building, but at least operationally, a strategy that he had highlighted was the purchase of of offsets and RECs. And again, it's what you measure gets managed. And so you need the ability to measure those activities and what you're doing, and then the negative impact, or the, depending on how you look at it, the negative carbon factor or the positive carbon factor, to go back to your reporting. You know, it's positive in that you're, you know, working on strategies to be carbon neutral. And this is one of those major strategies out there, but you need the tooling to be able to make sense of it and track how that fits into the overall carbon footprint. And then you also need to decide what all you're tracking from a carbon standpoint. Like, is it just building data, or is it some of these other things? You know, your employees are commuting to get to a building. You have business travel. You know, we talked about transportation and those kinds of things. So you need to decide what goes into your carbon reporting, and do you track it by a use, a volume, a distance? Is it weight-based? What are the metrics that are available to you to be able to track these and report on them as part of your report? The great thing, and when we start talking about data accessibility and the ease of this, is in some countries, you know, here in the US, because that's where I'm located, there are cost factors that can be applied towards your purchases. So the value of that being, it's an easier place to start, especially for scope 3 tracking, than it is to say, like, hey, all my employees, you got to give me the miles you flew for every trip over the last year. That becomes a data collection nightmare. If you could just go to your CFO and say, hey, give me the cost number in the general ledger that we posted for all the air travel purchases for everyone, that's probably a lot easier to get. And so it's nice that there are factors out there to make it at least easier to report on this, at least easier to start tracking this, until data accessibility becomes better and, you know, the industry provides this to you. So a bit in summary here, we're going to be wrapping up, but you know, there's a lot of challenges out there. There's a lot of legislation coming. We all know that. There's mandates by your teams internally and the team, you know, your leadership team. Hopefully the Verdantix stats, you know, I find a lot of value in them. I find them incredibly interesting. Hopefully those can at least give you some guidance on what others are doing out there and some strategies they're implementing, so you can start strategizing to lead towards, you know, your decarbonization effort. And hey, if you need some tooling and you need a database and some tools to help your organization, EnergyCAP's here to help. So thanks for participating. I really want to give a big shout out to Ben. Excellent work. We really appreciate Verdantix and the work you guys do in the industry. We will continue to support you, and appreciate your time, Ben.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for turning out for the webinar. If anyone has any additional questions that we weren't able to get to, then feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And I'll aim to get back to you as soon as possible. But yeah, thanks, John, and appreciate you guys having me.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.